4 years of warfare have shrunk the map of Europe to a measurement of 3 square miles. This is the net territorial movement achieved by the Russian army over the last 4 weeks of combat. Over an entire year, the front line shifted by 1,400 square miles, barely 0.6% of Ukraine's landmass. This frozen geometry creates an unsustainable systemic paradox. When hundreds of thousands of casualties produce zero geographic movement, the accumulated pressure must find a different exit point. On June 3, 2026, that pressure bypassed the front lines entirely, traveling 1,000 kilometers north to explode inside Russia's second-largest city. The target was not chosen for military mass, but for economic choreography. That morning, Moscow opened the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum to project stability and attract foreign capital. The Kremlin designed the production to showcase a stable country open for business, highlighted by a large delegation from Saudi Arabia. Instead, international attendees drove past columns of thick black smoke. A Ukrainian drone swarm had struck an oil terminal sitting exactly 10.5 miles from the convention center. You do deploy that much technical effort to reach a target that far from the front, only when the destruction of the financial illusion is the primary objective. The secondary strike targeted the physical mechanism protecting the money. Near Kronstadt, satellite imagery captured smoke rising from a Russian corvette named the Boy while it sat inside a dry dock. The Ukrainian military targeted this vessel because Moscow used it to escort the shadow oil fleet, the hidden maritime network the Kremlin relies on to evade sanctions. In a single night, Ukraine neutralized the infrastructure generating Russian revenue and the warship securing its transport. Moscow claimed its air defenses intercepted over 350 drones. Even at face value, a deployment of this physical magnitude ceases to be a tactical raid. It becomes a structural shift. This operation operated as a direct physical response to the events of June 2nd. 24 hours prior, Russia executed a heavy mass strike against Ukrainian population centers, killing at least 22 civilians, including 6 in Kyiv and 16 in the Dnipropetrovsk region. For the civilian population, the war remains a sequence of nights packed into subway stations. For the state apparatus, it has become a synchronized rhythm of kinetic exchange. Russia hits Ukrainian urban centers, Ukraine reaches deep into the Russian interior. Each blow triggers the next, but the geography of the latest messaging has fundamentally altered the baseline calculation. The conflict has officially evolved past the original containment zone. For 48 months, the foundational architecture of this war relied on an unspoken rule. The kinetic destruction remained bounded within the borders of Ukraine. This geographical limitation functioned as a mutual courtesy designed to insulate global energy markets. That insulation is gone. Over the past 48 hours, Russian officials began openly identifying the Western alliance as the direct coordinator of the strikes, reaching deep into their territory. The fiction of a bilateral conflict has dissolved under the weight of targeting intelligence and technical realities. The economic data explains why the insulation failed. Ukraine has directed over 20 strikes against Russian oil infrastructure in 2026, cutting April production by 400,000 barrels per day and dropping exports by 24%. However, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz during the Iran crisis drove global prices upward, refilling the Kremlin's treasury despite lower volumes. Russia requires approximately $115 a barrel by year-end to achieve budget targets without spending cuts. Forcing the Western alliance to apply heavy financial leverage, the Trump administration recently placed direct sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, Russia's 2 largest oil entities exporting over 3 million barrels per day, triggering a 5% spike in global prices and forcing state oil majors to suspend purchases. Yet, the political signals remain contradictory. Simultaneously, an American official arrived to attend the St. Petersburg Forum, marking the first official attendance in years. Washington strangles Russian oil with one hand, while walking the floor of Putin's prestige event with the other. This policy fragmentation has accelerated a breakdown in the mechanics of deterrence. Former CIA analyst Larry Johnson argues that Moscow has concluded its previous restraint was miscalculated as weakness. Each time Russia established a geopolitical red line and declined to act, The alliance interpreted the silence as permission to expand its involvement. The current Russian posture is shifting away from the localized defeat of Ukrainian forces toward forcing a strategic defeat of NATO's entire eastern policy. If Russia concludes that Western satellite reconnaissance is directly guiding the system's striking center, Petersburg, the cold logic of deterrence dictates a physical response against those assets. The language from Moscow has stripped away traditional diplomatic cushioning. On May 25th, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov held a phone call with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, after which Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov recommended that Western governments immediately evacuate their diplomats from the Ukrainian capital. A suggestion to pull diplomats out of Kyiv is not routine. It operates as the foundational architecture of an escalation warning, a signal designed to force Western ministries to recalculate their physical exposure. The system has reached its structural limit, where the gap between rhetoric and action is narrowing to zero. At the United Nations, Lavrov stated that Russia maintains no plans to attack NATO member states, but simultaneously declared that any aggression against Russian soil would meet an immediate, decisive response. The entire trajectory of the war now depends on who defines the boundaries of that aggression. If the Kremlin decides that a Western network guiding a drone into a dry dock crosses the threshold of direct participation, the boundary separating a localized war from an international escalation disappears. The mechanism of containment has cracked, and the primary gears have begun to turn against each other. A single distillation column inside an industrial refinery stands 40 meters tall and weighs 300 tons, yet its operational survival hinges on a sequence of internal fractional trays spaced millimeters apart. When a 30-kilogram Ukrainian drone payload warps these internal matrices, the entire multi-billion-dollar refining complex stops dead. By May 2026, these precise kinetic punctures had knocked out 15% of Russia's total oil processing capacity. The state apparatus attempted to absorb the shock by shifting from refined products to raw crude exports, an immediate adaptation that triggered an uncontrollable internal friction point. At coursing, raw crude requires hulls, and the Kremlin handles this through its shadow fleet, a loose armada of old, uninsulated tankers operating without standard international maritime insurance. As raw volume shifted suddenly to the sea, the cost of securing these aging vessels exploded by 200%. A single transport run from the Baltic Sea to Asia now requires 45 days, compared to the 5 days it previously took to reach Rotterdam. This geographic displacement effectively locked up millions of barrels of physical inventory on the water, turning a maritime logistics problem into an immediate cash flow crisis for the state treasury to bridge the resulting revenue deficit. The Kremlin began systematically draining the liquid portion of its national wealth fund. In early 2022, this sovereign reserve held $115 billion in liquid assets. By June 2026, the official ledger showed less than $28 billion remaining. The state spent the missing $87 billion not on structural economic growth, but on subsidizing industrial survival and military manufacturing. The rapid depletion of this financial cushion forced the central bank to confront a deteriorating domestic currency. Without any foreign exchange reserves left to deploy as a shield, the internal market reacted to this strain with immediate volatility. Fearing widespread domestic fuel shortages and skyrocketing agricultural transport costs, Moscow imposed a total embargo on gasoline exports. While this move temporarily stabilized local pump prices for 30 days, it simultaneously severed the primary source of cash flowing to private Russian energy firms. These corporations responded by freezing their capital expenditure budgets, halting the maintenance of the very wells that generate the nation's baseline wealth. The state tried to substitute the missing corporate capital with direct central bank loans, a choice that accelerated the domestic monetary collapse. The massive injection of unbacked currency into the military-industrial complex forced verified domestic inflation to 12%. To prevent a catastrophic run on the ruble, the central bank raised its benchmark interest rate to an unprecedented 22%. This rate functions as a financial execution order for the non-defense economy. A civilian manufacturing firm cannot survive when the cost of borrowing capital exceeds its profit margins 3 times over. Consequently, civilian factories across the country began entering bankruptcy, breaking domestic supply chains for basic consumer goods and shifting the entire economic structure onto a single vulnerable pillar. War production. This hyper-focus on war production created a severe labor deficit. The mobilization of 300,000 men into the military, combined with the flight of an estimated 600,000 tech and industrial professionals abroad, stripped the civilian economy of its vital human infrastructure. Military assembly plants solved their own shortages by poaching workers from municipal utilities, offering 4 times the average regional wage. This massive labor migration left cities without qualified engineers to maintain basic infrastructure. During the recent winter cycle, automated heating grids failed across 40 separate urban districts because the personnel required to manage the high-pressure steam valves had either transitioned to tank production or died on the front line. The state attempted to fix the ongoing military recruitment deficit by increasing the cash sign-on bonus for new soldiers to 2 million rubles. This massive liquidity injection backfired instantly because it did not create new economic value. It simply flooded provincial regions with speculative cash. Armed with these bonuses, families competed for a shrinking supply of imported goods, driving localized inflation past 20%. The central bank's high interest rates failed to stop this consumer spending because the cash entered the economy through state mandates rather than commercial credit loops. The mechanism designed to buy social compliance began destroying the purchasing power of the population. The technical decay has now reached the maritime bottleneck. Western maritime authorities, recognizing the ecological hazard of the shadow fleet, initiated strict environmental inspections at the Danish Straits. Any tanker lacking verifiable international insurance now faces indefinite detention. This regulatory wall has trapped 24 million barrels of Russian oil inside the Baltic Sea over the last 14 days. The Kremlin cannot redirect this volume through pipelines because the infrastructure leading to Europe remains physically severed or disabled. The inventory is backing up into the domestic pipeline network, threatening to overpressurize the storage facilities. The internal feedback loops have officially locked together. Russia cannot stop the war because its entire employment and industrial apparatus now depends on the defense budget. It cannot fix inflation because the defense budget requires printing money. It cannot repair its refining infrastructure because sanctions block the necessary components. And it cannot cut production without permanently freezing its own oil wells due to geological constraints. Every policy choice available to the state now accelerates a different vector of collapse. The system has passed the threshold where administrative decisions matter. The structural weight of the crisis is now driving the momentum entirely on its own. The cost of reshaping the physical map of European energy now stands at 840 billion euros. This is the collective sum spent by European capitals on temporary subsidies and alternative import terminals to disconnect from Siberian gas fields. The infrastructure that took 50 years to build was neutralized in less than 24 months. This massive financial divergence marks the definitive end of global market integration, replacing a system of efficiency with a fractured landscape governed entirely by geopolitical vulnerability. The primary beneficiary of this fragmentation is not the Western alliance, but the major buyers in Asia. Beijing and New Delhi now absorb 85% of Russia's seaborne crude exports, but they do so under a rigid framework of systemic exploitation. Chinese state refiners routinely demand discounts of $20 to $25 per barrel below the Brent global benchmark. Russia has transformed from a primary sovereign energy power into a captive resource colony, trading its long-term resource wealth for immediate survival cash. The state treasury receives just enough currency to fund the daily military budget. While losing the surplus needed to maintain its basic state functions, the domestic civilian population pays this price through a structural inversion of the social contract. In regional provinces outside Moscow and St. Petersburg, the primary mechanism of social mobility is no longer education or commercial enterprise, but the military death benefit. The state pays 5 million rubles to the family of a deceased soldier, an amount equivalent to 30 years of average local wages in regions like Buryatia or Tuva. This capital inflow acts as a highly artificial regional economic stabilizer, funding local real estate purchases and paying down consumer debts. The state has effectively monetized mortality, creating an economy where families rely on the attrition of their male population to maintain liquidity. Beneath the financial surface lies an irreversible physical decay of Russia's extractive core. 80% of Russia's active oil production relies on mature fields in western Siberia that require complex horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing technologies. These specialized systems were historically supplied and maintained by Western oilfield service corporations that have completely exited the domestic market. Without proprietary chemical inputs and computerized telemetry systems, the efficiency of these wells drops by 8% annually. In the Arctic extraction zones, where oil must be kept in continuous motion to prevent the permanent freezing of the pipeline networks, any prolonged production halt causes the physical collapse of the well shafts. Once a sub-zero well freezes, the geological pressure patterns change permanently, making the resource base unrecoverable by any domestic technical means. The geopolitical consequence is a profound contraction of strategic depth. The Baltic Sea, which previously served as Russia's primary maritime highway to Western markets, has transformed into a closed NATO lake. The accession of Sweden and Finland, combined with the continuous monitoring of the Danish Straits, means that every Russian merchant hull operates under the direct targeting lock of coastal anti-ship missile batteries. Moscow's Baltic Fleet is functionally blockaded inside its bases at Kronstadt and Kaliningrad, stripped of its ability to project power or secure the shadow fleet without initiating a direct clash with superior regional forces. The Kremlin's current administrative decisions reveal the advanced stage of this structural entrapment. On June 4th, the Ministry of Economy drafted emergency decrees to nationalize all foreign-owned assets remaining in the domestic food processing and logistics sectors. This measure seeks to seize physical inventories to counter growing domestic consumer shortages. However, nationalization does not manufacture the specialized enzymes, packaging films, taps, or automated sorting components required to keep these processing plants functional. The decision provides a temporary 30-day inventory buffer while ensuring the total long-term paralysis of the domestic food supply chain. Concurrently, the state has initiated mandatory price controls on basic agricultural commodities, including wheat and poultry. Economic history demonstrates the precise mechanics of this intervention. When the state forces a price cap below the cost of production, producers respond by hoarding their output or slaughtering their herds to minimize financial losses. The state's attempt to suppress inflation by administrative decree guarantees the emergence of structural black markets and physical rationing cards before the end of the current harvest cycle. The ultimate hazard of this systemic breakdown is its absolute asymmetry. The Western Alliance operates on a timeline dictated by electoral cycles and financial debt ceilings, searching for a stabilization point that avoids a direct kinetic confrontation. The Russian state apparatus, having dismantled its civilian economy and tied its survival to continuous conflict, cannot accept a stabilization point. For Moscow, a cessation of hostilities means confronting a 22% interest rate, millions of demobilized men with no civilian employment prospects, and a permanently degraded energy sector. The regime's internal survival now requires the maintenance of external crisis. This reality renders all current diplomatic initiatives fundamentally obsolete. The conflict cannot be resolved by a territorial compromise because the territory is no longer the driving engine of the system. The structural momentum of the war has surpassed the intentions of the actors who initiated it. The mechanisms of economic warfare, technological denial, and kinetic escalation have locked into an autonomous loop that continues to grind forward long after the original strategic assumptions have turned to dust. The system is not recovering. It is